The phone rang at 6:30 in the morning, before Sarah had even managed to finish her first cup of coffee. She stood in the kitchen barefoot, wearing an old, stretched-out t-shirt, and stared at the screen. The name flashing on the display still made her stomach tie itself into knots. Victor, her ex-husband, the man she had lived with for 9 years, and the man she had let go 6 months ago, signing the divorce papers on a gloomy morning at the county courthouse. Sarah didn't answer. She placed the phone face down on the counter, took a sip of her coffee, and closed her eyes. Not now. Not at this hour, when the day hadn't truly begun, and she could still pretend that the past held no power over her. The ringing stopped, only to immediately start again. Victor had always been persistent. For 9 years, she had considered this a sign of masculine strength, only to later realize that persistence and sheer, selfish stubbornness were two very different things. He wouldn't stop until she picked up. Sarah knew this, but she still didn't answer. Let him wait. Let him wait for once in his life. She poured the rest of her coffee down the sink, rinsed the mug, and went to get ready for work. Passing the mirror in the hallway, she stopped. 34 years old, dark circles under her eyes, dry lips, hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. 6 months ago, on the day of her divorce, she had looked better. It was a paradox back then. She had prepared for that day like it was a final exam. She had done her makeup, worn her best dress, wanting to show Victor that she would be just fine. Now, when there was no one left to show off for, she had stopped trying. Her mother called at exactly 7 a.m., right on schedule. Martha Lawson called her daughter every single morning ever since Sarah had moved back into her old childhood 2-bedroom duplex. Martha lived just 2 blocks away in a house with a small front yard and a perpetually squeaky porch gate. She could have easily just walked over, but she preferred to call. It was her way of giving her daughter space, or at least, pretending to. "Sarah, honey, did you eat breakfast?" "Mom, I had coffee." "Coffee is not breakfast. Come over. I made buttermilk pancakes. I have to be at work by 9, which means you have plenty of time. I'll be waiting." Martha hung up without waiting for an answer. She was persistent too, but her persistence didn't suffocate, it warmed. Like a fireplace in a freezing house, you could step away, but you were always drawn back to the heat. Sarah got dressed and stepped outside. April had turned out to be bitter and cold. The wind whipped her face with a fine, stinging drizzle. She walked her usual route through the neighborhood, past the local playground, which was completely empty this early in the morning. The swings swayed back and forth in the wind. Sarah looked away. The playground was something she had trained herself not to look at over the last few years. At first, it was because it hurt to be reminded of her shattered hopes. Later, it was because during every argument, Victor would throw their childlessness in her face like a guilty verdict. 9 years. For 9 years, she had gone to specialists, given blood, swallowed pills, and lain in hospital beds. 2 rounds of IVF, both of which ended in nothing but astronomical medical bills and heartbreak. And every time a cycle failed, Victor looked at her as if she were doing it on purpose. As if she enjoyed dragging herself through that hell over and over again. "Maybe you're just not meant to be a mother," he had said one evening, not even taking his eyes off the football game on TV. Not meant to be. As if he were talking about having a bad singing voice, or not knowing how to draw. Not meant to be. End of story. Stop torturing us. Sarah had cried the entire night on the bathroom floor, running the faucet so he wouldn't hear her. The next morning, she got up, washed her face, made him breakfast, and went to work, because that was what all the women in her family did. They gritted their teeth and kept moving. That was how her mother had lived her whole life after Sarah's father died when she was 12. That was how her grandmother survived poverty, a world war, and an alcoholic husband. Endurance was in their blood, passed down from mother to daughter, along with dark eyes and a stubborn set of the jaw. But endurance is not infinite. One day, it runs out. Not with a crash, not with a screaming match, but quietly like water draining from a cracked glass. Victor was the one who left first. Not for another woman at least, that was what he claimed at the time. He said he was just tired. He just couldn't do it anymore. He wanted a normal family with kids, with noise in the house, with a Christmas tree and presents piled underneath it. and Sarah couldn't give that to him. Couldn't or wouldn't, he said he didn't even see the difference anymore. She didn't argue. She didn't cry in front of him. She silently packed his things into 2 suitcases, set them by the door, and walked to her mother's house. Martha opened the door, took one look at her daughter, and understood everything without a word. She poured her a cup of tea, set down a plate of cookies, sat next to her, and simply existed beside her silently, warmly, reliably. A month after Victor moved out, Sarah learned that his "I'm just tired" routine was a lie. There was Ashley, a 26-year-old named Ashley, with long auburn hair and dimples. She was a yoga instructor at the upscale gym Victor had joined the previous year. Flexible, always smiling, perfectly healthy. Everything that, in Victor's eyes, Sarah was not. Chloe, the only friend who had stayed by Sarah's side through the divorce, broke the news. The rest of their friend group had quietly dissolved. Some took Victor's side, others just drifted away, not knowing what to say to an abandoned wife. "I thought you had a right to know," Chloe said, nervously shredding a paper napkin. They were sitting in a small Panera Bread near Sarah's office, rain streaking the windows. "He's been with her for 6 months. So, while we were still living together?" 6 months, which meant all those conversations about being tired, about needing a break, about their marriage running its course. It had all been a lie. A cover story. A beautiful wrapping paper for a very ordinary, ugly betrayal. Sarah finished her tea, looked out the window, and said, "Okay, okay?" Chloe's eyes went wide. "Just okay? What do you mean? What do you want me to say, Chloe? That I'm going to run after him? Smash her car windows? I'm 34. I have no husband, no kids, not even my own house. I live in the duplex where I grew up, sleeping on the same twin bed I slept in during high school. I don't have time to be hysterical. I have to figure out how to live." Chloe fell silent and never brought Ashley up again. And now, 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Victor was calling. Sarah reached her mother's house, pushed open the squeaky front gate, and walked up the porch steps. The house smelled of pancakes and something else, vanilla extract, probably. Martha met her wearing an apron, her face flushed from the stove. "Sit down, eat, and don't argue with me." Sarah sat, took a pancake, rolled it up, and dipped it in maple syrup. Her mother stood across from her, arms crossed, giving her that look. The look that meant, "I know something happened, but I won't ask until you're ready to tell me." "Victor called," Sarah said, keeping her eyes on her plate. Martha stayed quiet for a moment, then asked simply, "And?" I didn't answer. "Good." One word, but spoken in a tone that made Sarah feel the tight knot in her chest loosen just a fraction. Good. Her mother approved. That meant she was doing the right thing. Sarah arrived at her office 10 minutes before her shift started. She worked as an accountant for a mid-sized local construction firm, where she was highly valued for her accuracy and quiet diligence. It was a small team, 5 people in the office, not counting the boss. Everyone was used to the fact that Sarah Lawson wasn't the type to gossip at the water cooler or dissect Netflix shows in the break room. She came in, sat at her desk, booted up her computer, and worked quietly, methodically, without wasting a single word. Over 9 years of marriage, she had grown accustomed to being invisible. Victor loved being the center of attention, relegating her to the background. She had played the role for so long that she no longer knew how to step out of it. Her phone stayed in her purse, silent until noon. At 12:30, a text notification popped up. Sarah saw it, and her fingers reached for the screen of their own accord, even though her brain was screaming, "Don't read it. Don't do it. There is nothing good waiting for you there. We need to talk. It's important. Call me when you can." No, hello. No, how are you? Dry. Businesslike. As if there hadn't been 9 years of a shared life between them. A shared bed, shared breakfasts, and shared tears after every failed pregnancy test. Victor always knew how to excise the past, amputating it like a surgeon cutting out diseased tissue. One clean slice, and it was gone, fast and without regret. Sarah shoved the phone back into her bag and returned to her spreadsheets. The numbers on her monitor blurred, but she forced herself to focus. The quarterly financial report wasn't going to wait for her to sort out her emotional baggage. After work, she stopped by a CVS pharmacy and bought the exact same item she had purchased 3 times in the last 2 weeks, even though the first 2 tests had yielded the exact same result. She dropped the little box into her purse, zipped it shut, and walked home. Once inside, she locked herself in the bathroom, sat on the edge of the tub, and stared at the box in her hands for a long time. The previous 2 times, she had taken the test hastily in the evening, her hands shaking, and then sat on the cold tile floor in absolute disbelief. 2 lines, both bright, distinct, and ruthlessly unambiguous. She had read the instructions 3 times, checked the expiration date, and even Googled the likelihood of false positives. They happen, but rarely, and never twice in a row. She took the 3rd test slowly, methodically, counting the seconds on her watch. And when the 2 pink lines bled onto the white strip yet again, Sarah rested her hands on her knees and let out a long breath. She was pregnant. After 9 years of clinical infertility, after 2 brutal rounds of IVF, after finally accepting the reality that she would never be a mother, she was pregnant. Naturally, without doctors, without hormone injections, without IV drips. The father was Mark, a man she had been seeing for the past 3 months, if you could even call what they were doing seeing each other. They had met by accident in the waiting room of an urgent care clinic. Sarah was there for a routine physical required for her health insurance. He was waiting to see a doctor for a nasty sinus infection. The wait was endless, and they struck up a conversation. Mark Davis turned out to be a quiet, 40-year-old divorced man with a 10-year-old daughter, Katie, who lived with his ex-wife. He was a licensed electrician who rewired old houses. He always had scraped-up knuckles and smelled faintly of something industrial copper wire, ozone, or soldering flux. He wasn't extraordinarily handsome, or wealthy, or particularly witty or charming. But when he looked at Sarah, she felt seen. Not as background noise, not as an accessory to someone else's life, but as a living, breathing human being, looked upon with genuine interest and warmth. Their first date had been delightfully awkward. Mark invited her to the movies, and they both ended up falling asleep during some boring, overcomplicated spy thriller. They woke up at exactly the same time when the theater lights flicked on, looked at each other, and burst out laughing. There was so much relief in that laughter. Sarah realized right then, with this man, she could just be herself. She could fall asleep in a movie theater and not fear being criticized or mocked for it. They started dating cautiously, like adults, without any grand romantic illusions. Mark didn't shower her with extravagant bouquets or write her poetry. He fixed a faulty outlet in her hallway. He replaced the deadbolt on her front door. Once, he drove over in the middle of the night when a pipe burst under her kitchen sink. He stood knee-deep in water, wrestling with the shut-off valve and cursing through his teeth while she handed him wrenches and towels. It was the most intimate thing that had ever happened between them, that shared struggle against everyday life, without any pretense or pretty words. Sarah hadn't told him about the pregnancy yet. She was terrified. Not of his reaction. Mark was the kind of man who accepted life exactly as it came. She was terrified of something else. She was terrified of jinxing it. She felt like the moment she said the words out loud, the entire universe would collapse, just like it always had before. Superstition, idiocy, she knew that perfectly well. But after so many years of agonizing heartbreak, caution had been burned into her DNA. She had an appointment with an OB/GYN on Friday. 3 days left. 3 days of silence. 3 days of harboring a secret that felt like it was expanding inside her chest. That evening, Chloe called. "Hey, why do you sound so weird? Did something happen?" "No," Sarah lied. "Just tired." "Listen, the reason I'm calling." Victor posted pictures on Facebook. He married that Ashley girl. They went to the courthouse like a month ago, apparently. And she's pregnant. With twins. Sarah silently sank into a kitchen chair. Chloe kept talking through the receiver, but the words turned into a dull hum, as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the world, making all the sounds muffled and distant. Twins. Ashley was pregnant with twins. And for 9 years, Victor had told Sarah that she was the problem, that she was broken, that her body was refusing to do the one thing it was designed to do. Victor used to say, "You can't, but I want kids." As if she hadn't wanted them. As if she hadn't lain awake night after night, sobbing into her pillow, begging God, the universe, or anyone who would listen to give her just one chance. "Sarah, are you there?" Chloe's voice broke through the static. "I'm here." "Chloe, I have to go. We'll talk later." She hung up, walked over to the sink, and gripped the edges of the countertop with both hands, standing perfectly still for a long time. Then, she turned on the cold water, splashed her face, and stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. So, that was why he had called. To gloat, to shove his shiny new happiness right in her face, to say, "See, you were the defective one, not me. I found a normal woman, and look at the results." She knew Victor. After 9 years, she had memorized him like a tedious book she had read far too many times. He couldn't just live his life and be happy. He needed her to witness his happiness and suffer for it. He needed an audience. Without an audience, his victories tasted like ash. Sarah dried her face with a towel, turned off the faucet, and pulled out her phone. Victor's text was still sitting on the screen. "We need to talk. It's important. Call me when you can." She hit delete and slipped the phone into her pocket. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but that conversation was going to happen. She could feel it in her bones. And when it did, Victor Sterling was not going to hear the quiet, submissive Sarah he had been so used to keeping by his side for 9 years. He was going to hear an entirely different woman. A woman who had stepped out of his shadow and had no intention of ever hiding again. There was a glass of water on the kitchen table. Sarah instinctively placed a hand over her lower stomach. Inside her, a tiny human being was growing, a person who knew absolutely nothing about Victor, or Ashley, or the years of pain and humiliation. A tiny person who knew only one thing: the steady beat of its mother's heart. And to protect that heartbeat, Sarah was prepared to do whatever it took. She drank the water, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. For the first time in 6 months, she fell asleep quickly, without melatonin and without tears. And she didn't dream of the rain or the empty swing sets. She dreamt of something warm, soft, formless, and nameless, just warmth. Friday arrived in a blur. Sarah sat in the waiting room of the Women's Health Clinic on a hard plastic chair, nervously crumpling her intake number in her hands. Around her sat women with round bellies, scrolling through their phones or whispering to each other. One girl, very young, maybe 20 years old, was glowing so brightly it almost hurt to look at her. Beside her hovered a guy in sneakers and a wrinkled flannel shirt, sliding a pillow behind her back, running to the vending machine to get her water. Young, happy, entirely oblivious to the brutal sucker punches life could throw at you. Sarah looked away. She was 34. She was sitting here entirely alone. And her story contained absolutely none of the lightness and joy that surrounded that young couple. There was only anxiety. Thick, sticky anxiety that coated her throat. Dr. Linda Evans, a woman in her 50s with a sharp bob and tired but kind eyes, took her in without any unnecessary questions. She did an exam, sent her to the ultrasound room, and sat right beside her as the young ultrasound tech ran the transducer over Sarah's stomach. "There it is," the tech said, turning the monitor. "You see that? 6 weeks. We have a heartbeat." Sarah stared at the screen and saw nothing but a storm of gray static and a tiny, pulsating pixel. But that pixel was pulsing, beating, living. The sight of it took Sarah's breath away so violently that she dug her fingers into the edge of the exam table. "Is everything okay?" Dr. Evans asked. "Yes," Sarah choked out. I didn't believe it was real." "Doctor." Evans looked down at Sarah's chart, scanning her medical history, and raised her eyebrows. "I'm seeing 2 rounds of IVF here. Both failed. And a diagnosis of unexplained infertility going back 7 years. And now, out of nowhere, here we are." Mother Nature is incredibly unpredictable. Sometimes a woman struggles to conceive for years in one relationship, and then the environment changes, the stress vanishes, and the body just flips the switch itself. I've seen it happen more than once. Sarah nodded, though the doctor's words barely registered. She could only think about one thing: that pixel on the screen was alive. It was real, and she was a mother. For the first time in her life, she was going to be a mother. Sarah walked out of the clinic, clutching a stack of lab referrals, a list of prenatal vitamins, and a card with her next appointment date. She walked down the street, completely oblivious to the wind, the damp chill, or the puddles under her boots. The world around her had shifted. Not better, not worse, just different. As if someone had twisted a kaleidoscope, and the exact same colored glass pieces had suddenly formed a brand new pattern. She dialed Mark's number. He answered on the third ring. In the background, she could hear voices and the loud whine of a power drill. Sarah? Hey. I'm on a job site. Speak up. Mark, I need to see you tonight. It's important. He went silent for a second, and she heard the drill cut off. He must have stepped into another room. Did something happen? No. Well, yes. But not over the phone. Come over to my place tonight. Sarah, you're scaring me. Don't be scared. It's a good thing. She hung up and smiled. For the first time in a very long time, it was a genuine, effortless smile. Mark showed up at exactly 7 p.m., just as he promised. He was always on time. Victor used to run chronically late, and then get furious if Sarah dared to point it out. Mark, however, respected time, both his own and other people's. He arrived wearing a clean flannel shirt, his hair still damp from the shower, holding a plastic grocery bag that contained Honeycrisp apples and a block of sharp cheddar cheese. He always brought something. Never flowers or chocolates, but something practical and useful. Once, he brought a roll of electrical tape and 3 LED light bulbs because he noticed the fixture in her hallway had burnt out. Just in case, he had said with a shrug. Sarah sat him down at the kitchen table and put the kettle on. Mark sat calmly. He didn't rush her, didn't bombard her with questions. He just waited. He knew how to wait, a remarkably rare quality in a man. Mark, Sarah started, and immediately stalled. The speech she had rehearsed all afternoon completely vanished from her brain. I went to the doctor today. His face changed instantly. His brow furrowed. A flash of deep alarm crossed his eyes. Are you sick? I'm perfectly healthy. Mark. I'm pregnant. Silence. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, but neither of them moved a muscle. Mark stared at her, and Sarah watched as the information slowly registered in his brain. She watched him process it, pack it into his reality, and measure it against his life. Pregnant, he repeated, not as a question, but tasting the word on his tongue. 6 weeks. I had an ultrasound today. There's a heartbeat. The kettle was shrieking now. Mark stood up, lifted it off the burner, turned off the gas, and stood with his back to her for several agonizing seconds. Then he turned around, and Sarah saw something she had never expected. His eyes were wet. Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Are you serious? 3 tests and an ultrasound. It doesn't get more serious than that. He walked over to her, pulled up a chair right next to her, took both of her hands in his large, calloused, warm palms, and just held them. He didn't say anything. He didn't promise her the moon and the stars. He didn't shout for joy. He just held her hands in total silence, and there was more weight in that silence than in any grand speech. I know we haven't been together long, Sarah said softly. 3 months, it's nothing. I'm not expecting you to. Stop, he interrupted. Don't tell me what you don't expect. Tell me what you want. She looked at him and suddenly felt something snap inside her, something she had kept tightly compressed for years. It was as if the dam she had painstakingly built, brick by agonizing brick, had suddenly fractured, and through that crack poured everything at once. Fear, hope, joy, agony, relief. I want this baby, she said, her voice breaking. I have dreamt of this for 9 years, and I want you to be here with me. But if you aren't ready, I will understand. I can do this on my own. I'm used to doing things on my own. Mark lifted her hand to his mouth and kissed her knuckles. It was a clumsy, old-fashioned gesture that entirely contradicted his rugged, blue-collar appearance. I am going to be here, he said simply. This is my kid, and you are my person. We'll figure the rest out as we go. Sarah buried her face in his shoulder and began to cry. Not from grief, like she used to, but from something entirely different and unfamiliar, from the realization that sometimes things actually work out. Sometimes life doesn't take things away, it gives them back. Sometimes fate doesn't kick you while you're down, it gently pats you on the head. It happens, apparently, even to people who had completely given up hope. Mark sat there holding her, stroking her hair. Outside the window, the rain was dying down. The kettle cooled on the stove, and in the tiny kitchen of that old two-bedroom duplex, two grown adults held onto each other as if the entire world outside those walls could collapse at any second. But as long as they were together, it would hold. Sarah decided to tell her mother the next day. She wanted one single night to share the news with just Mark, to sit and drink tea and exist in the quiet space of their shared secret. No advice, no gasping, no maternal tears or interrogations, just one peaceful night for the two of them, before the rest of the world found out and inevitably interfered. Martha found out the following morning. Sarah walked over to her house, sat down at the table, took a pancake, rolled it up, and said, "Mom, I'm pregnant." Martha was standing at the stove with a spatula in her hand. The spatula froze in midair. She slowly turned around, fixing her daughter with a long, penetrating gaze, as if trying to calculate whether this was some kind of cruel joke. Sarah wasn't joking. Martha saw it in her eyes, and the spatula slipped from her hand, hitting the linoleum floor with a dull thud. "Oh my God," Martha gasped. Sarah. She didn't rush over to hug her. She didn't scream with joy. She collapsed onto a kitchen stool and began to cry. Quietly, soundlessly. Tears simply streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. Sarah stood up, walked over, and wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders. They stood like that, embracing in the cramped kitchen that smelled of burnt butter, both completely silent, because words were entirely unnecessary. Martha knew everything. She knew about every specialist visit, every failed cycle, every night her daughter had sobbed into her pillow. She knew how Victor had systematically broken Sarah down day by day with his indifference, his petty reproaches, his silent contempt for a woman who couldn't bear him a child. For 9 years, Martha had carried that agonizing weight right alongside her daughter. And now, as the pain finally receded, she couldn't stop the tears. "How far along?" she finally asked, wiping her face with her apron. 6 weeks. The doctor says everything looks perfect. And the father? Your Mark. Does he know? He's thrilled. Martha went quiet. She picked the spatula off the floor and washed it in the sink. He's a solid man. Sarah paused. Not because she doubted it, but because she was looking for the right word. He's real, Mom. Not good or bad. He's just real. Martha nodded. For her, that was more than enough. She had lived her life with a husband who was charming in public and unbearable behind closed doors. She knew the cheap value of pretty words and had stopped believing in them decades ago. Real was infinitely better than good. "Take care of yourself," Martha said. "Bring him over for Sunday dinner. Let me get a good look at him." It was an invitation and an interrogation rolled into one. Martha excelled at multitasking. Sarah smiled and nodded. Sunday dinner went surprisingly smoothly. Mark arrived in a clean button-down shirt, bringing a jar of local honey from a guy he knew and a half-gallon jug of fresh apple cider. Martha appreciated it. Not the gifts, she set those aside without much fanfare. She appreciated how Mark carried himself, how he walked in, wiped his boots on the mat, and greeted her simply, without trying to suck up or turn on any artificial charm. How he sat at the table and didn't shower her with over-the-top compliments about the food, but silently polished off 2 massive bowls of her beef stew, which was the highest possible praise for the woman who cooked it. Martha observed him throughout the meal. How he spoke to Sarah calmly, as an equal, without a hint of condescension. How he listened attentively without interrupting. How he made absolutely zero effort to impress her, and was perfectly content to just sit there and eat his stew. Victor, she recalled, had spent his very first visit talking non-stop about his career for 40 minutes, without once asking what his future mother-in-law did for a living. Mark actually asked, and not just to be polite. He genuinely wanted to know. "I worked at the post office for 30 years, Martha told him. "I'm retired now." Just the garden, the chickens out back, and the cat. That's my whole life. Chickens are good, Mark said seriously. My grandma had chickens. I used to steal the eggs from under them when I was a kid. They used to peck the hell out of me. Martha let out a sharp bark of laughter, and Sarah knew Mark had passed the test. After dinner, Mark volunteered to help fix the backyard fence. A few of the boards had come loose, and Martha had been meaning to call a handyman for a month. Mark found a hammer and nails in the shed, and spent an hour wrestling with the wood until the fence was sturdy again. Martha stood on the back porch and watched. When he finished, she called him in for iced tea and cookies, and for the first time, she called him by his first name, instead of that guy of yours. Sarah sat on the porch steps, warming her hands around a mug, thinking about how bizarrely life rearranged itself. A year ago, she had been married to a man who was embarrassed to visit her mother's house. Victor thought Martha's neighborhood was trashy, her garden a ridiculous waste of time, and Martha herself a woman devoid of ambition, who was perfectly content to rot away with her chickens and her cat. He never said it out loud, but Sarah could read it on his face every single time they came over for the holidays. The pursed lips, the bored glaze in his eyes, his thumbs constantly scrolling on his phone under the table. Mark was different. He grew up in a house exactly like this one, with the same kind of backyard and the same kind of squeaky gate. To him, Martha's world wasn't trashy. It was a normal, decent human life that he understood and respected. That evening, after Mark drove home, Martha called her daughter. "He's a normal guy," she said curtly. "He's good with his hands, he eats my stew, and he doesn't put on airs. Hold on to him." Sarah laughed out loud. Coming from her mother, that was the highest possible compliment. The following week passed peacefully. Sarah's blood work came back, and everything was perfectly normal. She started taking the prenatal vitamins Dr. Evans prescribed. She gave up coffee and started going to bed earlier. Nobody at the office suspected a thing. It was too early to show, and aside from a little morning nausea, which she managed by covertly chewing saltine crackers in the bathroom stall, she was fine. Life was settling into a quiet rhythm. No fanfare, no dramatic plot twists. Day by day, it was just getting a little warmer, a little brighter, a little easier to breathe. April shifted into May. The rain stopped, and the lilac bushes in Martha's front yard bloomed, filling the air with a thick, sweet scent. And then, Victor reappeared. This time, he didn't wait for Sarah to answer her phone. He just showed up. On a Tuesday evening, entirely unannounced, he rang the doorbell. Sarah opened it without checking the peephole. He was standing on the porch tall, tanned, wearing an expensive leather jacket, with an expression on his face that she knew all too well. It was the look he wore when he was about to say something he believed would utterly destroy her. "Hey," Victor said. "You weren't answering my calls, so I had to come in person." "What do you want?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with how incredibly steady her voice sounded. Victor smiled. A wide, triumphant smile. The smile of a man who had shown up to witness a crushing defeat and intended to savor every second of it. "I have news, Sarah. Huge news." He stood in the doorway, blocking the porch light, and Sarah caught a whiff of his cologne. New, expensive, unfamiliar. He used to wear cheap drugstore deodorant. Ashley had clearly elevated his standards. Sarah stood in the doorway and remained silent. She waited, let him talk, let him spill whatever venom he had dragged all the way over here. And then he would leave. She would lock the door, and she would go right back to living her new, quiet, authentic life. Victor stepped into the duplex without waiting to be invited, acting as if it were still his home and he had the right to barge in whenever he pleased. Sarah didn't argue. She took a step back and let him pass. There was no point trying to physically shove a man out the door when he had clearly arrived with a specific agenda. He wouldn't leave until he delivered his monologue anyway. He walked into the kitchen, his eyes sweeping over the painted cabinets, the old linoleum floor, the aging refrigerator in the corner. Sarah saw the corner of his mouth twitch, a smirk. He was comparing this outdated kitchen to his shiny new life, a luxury apartment, or wherever it was he was renting with his new wife. And the comparison was heavily skewed against Sarah. He wanted her to notice. She noticed, and she couldn't care less. "I'm not offering you anything to drink," Sarah said, leaning against the doorframe. Talk. Why are you here? Victor turned to face her and crossed his arms over his chest. A power pose, broad shoulders, chin tilted up, eyes narrowed. 9 years ago, she had fallen in love with that exact pose. With that confidence, with that masculine strength that she believed could protect her from anything in the world. Later, she learned that his strength was never directed outward for protection. It was directed inward, used to crush whoever was standing closest to him. I got married, Victor announced, to Ashley, a month ago. I know. He frowned slightly. He hadn't expected her to know, and he certainly hadn't expected her to say it so casually. Well, congratulations, Sarah added in a flat tone. Is that it? No, that's not it. He paused. A dramatic, meticulously calculated pause, as if he had rehearsed this in front of a bathroom mirror. Sarah knew this tactic of his, dragging out the moment, keeping the other person in suspense. It used to work. She used to freeze, wait, and panic. Now, she just stood there looking at him, and inside, she felt entirely hollow. Not cold, not hot, just empty. The space where her love for this man had once lived had been cleared out long ago, and was now overgrown with something new, calm, and unshakable. Ashley is pregnant, Victor declared, his voice ringing with pure triumph. Twins, a boy and a girl. My new wife is giving me twins right out of the gate. And you couldn't even manage to give me 1 in 9 years. You just wasted a decade of my life. The words struck exactly where he had aimed, right in the most agonizing, unhealed wound, the one he had inflicted himself. Sarah felt a surge of heat flash from her chest up into her throat. For a fraction of a second, she wanted to scream, to throw something at his smug, arrogant face, but she didn't move a muscle. She stood there and breathed slowly, exactly the way she had trained herself to do over the last 6 months. In through the nose, out through the mouth, in, out. Victor was waiting for a reaction. For tears, for screaming, for a total breakdown. That was what he had come for. He had driven all the way over here to watch her shatter, to see her fall to her knees under the crushing weight of his shiny new happiness and her own ancient grief. But Sarah didn't shatter. She looked him dead in the eyes, unblinking, and said, I have news too. But you aren't going to like it. Victor blinked. This was not in the script. In his head, the scene played out very differently. He drops the bomb, she weeps uncontrollably. He exits as the conquering hero. Sarah, having news, did not fit into that narrative. What news? He asked, a flicker of apprehension bleeding into his voice. I'm pregnant too, Victor. 8 weeks. Everything is perfect. The baby is completely healthy. Silence crashed into the kitchen like a dropped piano. Victor stood there, staring at her. And for the first time in her life, Sarah watched the absolute certainty drain out of his eyes. Slowly, drop by drop, like air hissing out of a punctured tire. His shoulders slumped a fraction of an inch. His arms uncrossed. His jaw slacked. What? He asked, his voice suddenly hollow. You heard me. I am pregnant. Naturally. Without any doctors or IVF procedures. I just got pregnant. Imagine that. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't trying to twist the knife. And she had no desire for revenge. She was simply stating a fact, and the fact itself proved to be devastating enough. Victor remained silent. Sarah could practically see the gears grinding furiously behind his eyes. He was calculating, adding, subtracting. If she was pregnant, that meant the problem hadn't been her, or at least, not entirely her. Which meant that all those years when he had blamed her, humiliated her, and made her feel utterly defective and worthless, all of it had been for nothing. It was wrong. It was horribly unjust. No. Victor Sterling did not know how to admit he was wrong. He didn't know how, and he absolutely refused to learn. Whose is it? He snapped harshly. That is none of your business. You found some guy 5 minutes after our divorce? 3 months. And I repeat, it is none of your business. We are divorced. You are married to another woman. You have your life, and I have mine. Victor clenched his jaw. The muscles rippled violently under his skin. Automatically, out of sheer reflex, Sarah took a half step backward. Not out of fear he had never hit her. out of habit. Over 9 years, she had learned to read his emotional state through microscopic tells: a clenched jaw, narrowed eyes, white knuckles. It all meant that rage was building up inside him, and he was about to unleash it. He used to unleash it through words heavy, toxic words designed to obliterate her self-esteem. "So, you couldn't have a kid with me, but you can spread your legs for this new guy?" he spat. "I waited for 9 years. I suffered for 9 years, and it turns out, you just didn't want to have kids with me." Sarah shook her head. She could have explained it to him. She could have told him about the devastating effects of chronic stress, about psychosomatic blocks, about how the human body actively rejects pregnancy when a woman is living in a state of profound misery. She could have quoted Dr. Evans: "The environment changes, the stress vanishes, and the body just flips the switch itself." She could have, but she didn't. Because Victor wasn't looking for an explanation. He was looking for someone to blame. He always needed a scapegoat. And that scapegoat had always been her. "I don't owe you any explanations," Sarah said firmly. "Get out, Victor. Leave. Now." He stood there for a few more seconds, staring at her with a toxic cocktail of rage, profound confusion, and something else. Maybe resentment, or maybe, just maybe, deep shame. Then he spun on his heel and stormed out, slamming the front door so violently that a framed photo fell off the entryway shelf. The glass spider-webbed, but didn't shatter. It was a picture of Sarah and her mother, both of them smiling, both of them happy. Sarah picked up the frame, set it back on the shelf, and then slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor of the hallway. She closed her eyes. Her hands were shaking. Her legs were shaking. Everything inside her was vibrating. But cutting through the tremors was something entirely different. Relief. She had spoken her truth. He had heard it, and the world had not imploded. She was sitting on the hardwood floor alive, pregnant, entirely free, and the walls around her were standing firm. 5 minutes later, she stood up, splashed cold water on her face, and called Mark. "Mark," she said, "come over. I need to see you." "I'm on my way," he answered without a single follow-up question. Just, "I'm on my way." And that was more than enough. Mark arrived in 20 minutes, ringing the doorbell with 2 short, quick bursts, exactly the way he always did. Sarah opened the door. He stepped inside and immediately scanned her from head to toe, as if checking to make sure she was physically unharmed. "What happened?" Victor came over. Mark pulled off his work jacket, hung it on a hook, toed off his boots, and walked into the kitchen. He sat down at the table. He executed all these motions in total silence, methodically, giving his brain time to process the information. Sarah had already noticed this trait of his. He never reacted impulsively. He organized the data in his head first, and only spoke when he was ready. Victor had been the exact opposite. Victor spoke first, thought second, and most of the time, didn't bother thinking at all. "Tell me," Mark said. Sarah sat across from him and recounted everything. The ignored phone calls, his sudden appearance on the porch, the twins, the vile insults he had hurled in her face, and exactly how she had responded. She told the story evenly, without breaking down. But when she reached the part where Victor accused her of wasting a decade of his life, her voice finally betrayed a slight tremor. Mark listened without saying a word. He didn't interrupt, didn't nod patronizingly, didn't make exaggerated faces of sympathy. He just listened. And when Sarah finished, he remained silent for a few seconds before asking, "Does he know about me?" "No. I didn't tell him who the father was. I told him it was none of his business." "You were right. It isn't." Mark reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm, calloused, and smelled like lava soap. He sat quietly for another moment, then added, "Sarah, I'm going to tell you one thing. If he ever shows up here again and talks to you like that, I want you to call me. Not after he leaves. While he is here, I will drive over, and I will explain to him that he does not get to speak to a woman like that. I'll explain it to him calmly, man to man. But I will make sure he understands." Sarah looked at him. Mark wasn't threatening anyone. He wasn't working himself up into a macho frenzy. He delivered the statement in the exact same steady, level voice he used to discuss rewiring a circuit breaker or fixing a fence. And it was precisely that unwavering steadiness that made his promise 1,000 times more convincing than any loud, chest-thumping threats. "You don't have to, Mark. I can handle him myself. He won't come back anyway. He got exactly what he came for, and now he's going to go home and choke on it." What did he get? A massive blow to his ego. He walked in here, utterly convinced that he was the grand winner and I was the pathetic loser. He walked out realizing that reality didn't align with his fantasy. For Victor, there is literally nothing worse than realizing he isn't the main character in the story. Mark let out a single, sharp exhale of a laugh. "All right. But if anything changes, you call me." They drank tea and talked about other things. Mark mentioned that his boss had offered him a foreman position on a new commercial site, and he was thinking about taking it. The pay was a bit better, the responsibility was higher, but the respect was real. Sarah listened, marveling at how simple it was with him. How remarkably easy life could be when the person sitting across from you wasn't playing a role, wasn't posturing, and wasn't desperately trying to seem more important than they actually were. Mark left around 11 p.m. He kissed her on the forehead, exactly as he did every time they said goodbye, and said, "Go to bed. You're sleeping for 2 now." She locked the door behind him and leaned her back against the wood. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she was smiling. It was a bizarre contradiction, but lately she had grown accustomed to paradoxes, crying and smiling at the same time, being terrified and utterly hopeful, remembering the agony of the past while fiercely believing in the future. The next 2 weeks passed without incident. Victor didn't call and didn't show up. He was likely digesting his bruised ego, just as Sarah had predicted, or he had simply redirected his focus back to his new life with Ashley and the impending arrival of twins. Sarah actively tried not to think about him, and she was getting better at it every single day. Chloe came over on a Saturday, hauling a massive garbage bag full of baby clothes. "These are from my niece," she explained. "Onesies, swaddles, sleep sacks, they're all freshly washed. I know it's early, but it doesn't hurt to have them." Sarah opened the bag and pulled out a tiny, newborn-sized onesie with yellow stripes. The fabric was unimaginably soft and weightless. She pressed it against her cheek and squeezed her eyes shut. "Chloe," she whispered, "I'm so terrified." "Of what?" "That something is going to go wrong. That I'm going to wake up and this is all just a dream. Or that it's going to be like it used to be." Chloe sat next to her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "The past is the past. Everything is different now. You have a solid man, a normal pregnancy, and a normal life. You have to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop, Sarah. Not everything in life is a trap." Sarah nodded, though the anxiety still simmered in her gut. After 9 years of heartbreak, she was as accustomed to anxiety as one is to chronic pain. The pain eventually fades, but the instinct to brace for it remains. At 10 weeks, Sarah went in for her second ultrasound. This time, Mark went with her. He sat in the clinic waiting room, surrounded by pregnant women, looking entirely out of place. A large, broad-shouldered tradesman with grease-stained work boots, sitting amidst pastel-painted walls and posters promoting breastfeeding. But he sat patiently. He didn't complain, didn't pull out his phone to scroll. He just waited. When Sarah walked out of the exam room, he stood up and looked at her, his eyes asking the question he was too afraid to voice. "Everything is perfect," she said, growing exactly on schedule. Mark let out a massive breath. Sarah only realized right then just how tense he had been, despite his impressive efforts to hide it. His hands, shoved deep into his jacket pockets, had been clenched into tight fists. She looped her arm through his and led him outside, where the May sun was shining and the air smelled of blooming cherry blossoms. "Mark, can I ask you something?" "Ask." "Were you scared?" He was quiet for a moment. She watched him actively fighting his ingrained male habit of suppressing his emotions. "Yeah," he finally said. "I was terrified. When Katie was born, I basically lost my mind with anxiety. And here, Sarah, you're 34. You have a brutal medical history. Of course I was scared, but I kept my mouth shut. What was I supposed to say? You were already nervous enough. You didn't need me dumping my paranoia on you." Sarah pressed her face against his shoulder. They walked down the sidewalk, surrounded by strangers, and nobody paid them any mind. Just an ordinary, middle-aged couple, not particularly loud, completely devoid of glamour or pretense. But the bond between them was so solid and so intensely warm that Sarah could physically feel it radiating, like the heat from a cast-iron stove in a freezing cabin. That evening, she was sitting in her living room sorting through the bag of baby clothes Chloe had brought, organizing them into neat little stacks on the coffee table. Onesies with onesies, sleep sacks with sleep sacks. It was a tedious, mindless task that brought her a bizarre, almost physical sense of euphoria. For the first time in her entire life, she was folding baby clothes, not for a friend's baby shower, but for her own child. Her phone rang, an unknown number. Sarah debated sending it to voicemail, but something compelled her to answer. Hello? Sarah. It was a female voice, young, trembling, painfully hesitant. This is Ashley, Victor's wife. We need to talk. Sarah slowly sank back into the armchair. A tiny yellow onesie slipped from her fingers and landed on the rug in a soft puddle of fabric. Ashley. Victor's new wife was calling her. This was the absolute last thing she had ever expected. I'm listening, Sarah said, her own voice sounding foreign in her ears. I know it's incredibly weird that I'm calling you, but I literally have no one else to talk to. After Victor came to see you, he's been completely unhinged. He isn't eating, he isn't sleeping, he snaps at everything I say. I interrogated him for 3 days until he finally confessed. About you being pregnant. Ashley was speaking rapidly, stumbling over her words, swallowing the ends of her sentences. She was in distress. Sarah could hear it in her breathing, shallow, erratic, like someone who had spent hours hyping themselves up to make a terrifying phone call. And? Sarah asked. She didn't want to be cruel, but she honestly couldn't fathom what this girl wanted from her. He's saying horrible things. He's saying you did it on purpose, that you deliberately got pregnant just to humiliate him. He said you were always like that, doing things purely out of spite to ruin his life. Sarah, I know we aren't friends and we never will be, but I desperately need to know the truth. Was he really like this for all 9 years? Or is this just some temporary psychotic break? Sarah closed her eyes. The truth. Ashley wanted the truth. A 26-year-old girl, 6 months pregnant with twins, married for 3 months, was suddenly terrified of the man she had tied her life to, and was calling his ex-wife for answers because she had absolutely nowhere else to turn. If the situation had been even slightly less absurd, Sarah might have found it tragic. But she actually did feel sympathy for her, because Sarah knew exactly what it meant to live with Victor Sterling and slowly lose your mind. Ashley, Sarah said, choosing her words with extreme caution. I am not going to sit here and trash Victor. It's not my place anymore. You are husband and wife, you are about to have children, and I have absolutely no desire to insert myself into your marriage. But I will tell you this one thing. Sarah took a breath. Victor is not an inherently evil person. He doesn't hit, he doesn't drink, he pays his bills. But he has one fatal flaw. He is always right. Always, and in every single scenario. If something goes wrong, it is everyone else's fault but his. And the closer you are to him, the more of that blame falls directly on your shoulders. For 9 years, I was the sole reason we couldn't have a child. 9 years. And when he packed his bags, he left with a perfectly clear conscience, because in his reality, I ruined everything. Not him, me. The line went dead silent. Sarah could hear Ashley breathing, and then something else, a choked sob, instantly stifled. He tells me that too, Ashley whispered. He says I'm not eating right, that I'm too lazy, that I need to focus on my fitness because I'm carrying 2 babies and I need to stay in shape. I'm 6 months pregnant. My ankles are swollen to twice their size. I'm still throwing up every morning, and he tells me I've let myself go. Sarah gripped the phone tightly. 9 years ago, she had heard those exact same words, just tailored to a different scenario. You aren't trying hard enough. You aren't doing the treatments right. You need to focus more on your health. The phrasing changed. The core message remained identical. You aren't good enough. You aren't trying hard enough. It's your fault. Ashley, listen to me carefully. I am not going to give you life advice. You are a grown woman, and you will figure this out yourself. But if you ever find yourself in a really dark place, and you feel like you have absolutely no one in your corner, you can call me. I can't promise I can fix anything, but I will listen to you. I'm very good at that. Ashley was quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "Thank you. I didn't know what kind of person you were," Victor told me. "He told me you were cold. Heartless. He said it was impossible to live with you." "Did he?" Sarah let out a dark chuckle. Cold and heartless. She was the woman who had cried herself to sleep for 9 years. The woman who walked through the 7th circle of hell, fighting infertility. The woman who loved that man so desperately that she completely erased her own identity. Heartless. Well, of course he did. "Ashley, take care of yourself and those babies. That is the only thing that matters right now. The rest of it will eventually sort itself out." She ended the call and sat frozen for a long time. Then she picked up the yellow striped onesie from the rug, smoothed it out, folded it perfectly, and placed it on top of the stack. Her hands weren't shaking. Her heart was beating with a slow, steady rhythm. She had anticipated that this phone call would send her spiraling into a panic attack, but instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if the final piece of a massive, agonizing jigsaw puzzle had just snapped into place, and the picture was finally complete. Victor hadn't changed. He found a brand new woman, but he was the exact same man, the same cruel words, the same relentless criticism, the same absolute inability to view his partner as an equal human being. Ashley would survive a year, maybe 2, maybe 5, and one day she would find herself standing exactly where Sarah had stood, drained, hollowed out, entirely stripped of her sense of self. Or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe Ashley would prove to be tougher. Maybe having twins would give her an anchor that Sarah never had. Maybe. Sarah didn't wish ill upon Ashley. She didn't necessarily wish her well either. She wasn't Mother Teresa. But there was no vindictive glee. There was only a weary, adult pity for a young woman who had absolutely no idea what she had signed up for. That night, she told Mark everything. He sat at the kitchen island nursing a mug of tea, listening in total silence, exactly as he always did. When Sarah finished, he shook his head. What a piece of work. He's got a new wife, 6 months pregnant with twins, and he's running around trying to settle scores with his ex. The guy has way too much free time. It's about proving he's right, Sarah explained. Being right is more important to him than being happy. Mark looked at her and suddenly said, "Sarah, let's move in together." She froze, her tea mug halfway to her mouth. "What? I'm serious. Enough of this driving back and forth across town. You're getting further along. You need someone around full-time. I can move in here, or you can move into my place. Whatever you want." Sarah slowly set her mug down on the table. She hadn't expected this conversation tonight. She figured it would come up naturally a few months down the line, closer to her due date. But Mark, for all his slow, methodical nature, was incredibly decisive when he realized action was required. "Mark, we've been together for 3.5 months. It's incredibly fast. I know that. But the baby isn't going to hit pause while we figure out our relationship timeline. You're giving birth in 6 months, and I want to be here. Every single day. Not just evenings and weekends." She looked at him. At his calm, slightly exhausted face, at his calloused hands, at the gray creeping into his temples, and she thought, this is it. This was exactly what she had spent 9 years waiting for. Not grand, poetic declarations of romance. Not promises of a fairy tale life. Just a simple, honest, "I want to be here every single day." "All right," she said. "Move in here. At least the paint is fresh." Mark finished his tea, rinsed his mug in the sink, and said, "I'll bring my stuff over tomorrow. It's not much. A suitcase and a toolbox." Sarah burst out laughing. For the first time on this long, bizarre, impossible day, she laughed with her whole chest. Mark moved in the very next afternoon, exactly as promised. He brought one large suitcase, a heavy red toolbox, and a cardboard box full of paperbacks. Sarah had worried that it would feel intrusive to share her space with a man after 6 months of fiercely guarded independence, but it wasn't strange at all. Mark slotted into her daily routine as effortlessly as a missing gear in a clockwork mechanism. He woke up before her and made oatmeal, because Dr. Evans had sternly mandated a healthy breakfast. In the evenings, he methodically repaired everything that had been quietly deteriorating for months: the leaky bathroom faucet, the crooked cabinet hinge, the floorboard in the hallway that screeched every time she stepped on it. The duplex seemed to wake up under his hands. It felt warmer, cozier, functionally sound. A week after moving in, Mark brought his daughter over. Katie was 10 years old, skinny, with her father's gray eyes and a long blonde braid. She walked into the house cautiously, scanning the corners like a startled stray animal deposited in unfamiliar territory. Sarah completely understood. It was a massive psychological leap for a child. Her dad lived with a new woman. That woman was pregnant. That was a hell of a lot to process for a 10-year-old brain. Sarah didn't suffocate Katie with forced hugs or overly sweet nicknames. She simply offered her a mug of hot cocoa and some Oreos, showed her where the bookshelf was, and left her alone. Katie spent the entire evening curled up on the sofa, reading a fantasy novel, occasionally shooting cautious, calculating glances in Sarah's direction. Right before she left, as Mark was helping her put on her jacket, Katie suddenly looked at Sarah and said, "It's really quiet in here. I like it." Sarah smiled. It was a start. Katie started coming over on weekends and slowly began to thaw. She helped Sarah cook, which mostly involved spilling flour on the floor and confusing sugar for salt, but she tried incredibly hard. She chattered about middle school drama, her friends, and the pet hamster her mom absolutely refused to let her buy. One Saturday afternoon, while Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through the baby clothes Chloe had donated, Katie walked over and quietly sat in the adjacent chair. She picked up a tiny cotton newborn beanie and turned it over in her hands. "Is this for the baby?" she asked softly. "Yes. Do you know what it is yet? A boy or a girl?" "Not yet. We'll find out soon." Katie went quiet for a moment, then said in a devastatingly serious, adult tone, "I really, really want it to be a girl. I've always wanted a little sister." A lump formed in Sarah's throat. She reached out and gently stroked the top of Katie's head. The little girl didn't pull away. Summer arrived hot and suffocatingly humid. Sarah's belly rounded out noticeably, and hiding her pregnancy at the office became impossible. Her coworkers threw a mini celebration. Her boss assured her her position would be secure while she was on maternity leave. Dr. Evans declared at every single checkup that everything was progressing flawlessly. Blood pressure normal, fetal development right on track. At the 20-week anatomy scan, the ultrasound tech smiled and said, "It's a boy." Sarah immediately called her mother from the parking lot. "Mom, it's a boy." Martha was dead silent for 3 agonizing seconds, and then, her voice violently trembling, she said, "A grandson. I'm going to have a grandson." And she began to weep. Sarah stood in the sweltering asphalt parking lot and cried right along with her. 2 women, mother and daughter, crying into their cell phones miles apart, both smiling through their tears, both overwhelmingly happy. Martha threw herself into preparations with the intensity of a 4-star general. She crocheted booties, sewed burp cloths, and ransacked her attic until she found the antique wooden bassinet that baby Sarah had slept in over 3 decades ago. She scrubbed it down and sanded the wood. Mark picked it up in his truck, brought it home, and set it up in the corner of the master bedroom. Sarah stared at it and still couldn't entirely process the fact that in a few short months, a tiny human being, her son, would be sleeping in it. In late August, when Sarah was 26 weeks along, unexpected news arrived. Ashley gave birth 3 weeks prematurely. Twins, a boy and a girl, exactly as advertised. Chloe, who had been stalking Victor's social media presence with the rabid dedication of a private investigator, delivered the update. She had the babies, Chloe reported over the phone. He posted 1 million pictures on Facebook. Proud father, giant bouquets of roses, mylar balloons, the whole performance. Sarah listened, thanked her friend for the update, and hung up. She felt absolutely nothing. No envy, no anger, no bitterness. The massive gaping wound where all that pain used to reside had completely closed. It had finally, permanently healed. But 3 days later, Ashley called. Her voice was completely different. It wasn't the hesitant, trembling whisper from the last time. It was exhausted, hoarse, laced with an icy, metallic edge. Sarah. He left. What do you mean he left? Exactly what it sounds like. The babies have been screaming nonstop. I haven't slept in 72 hours. He packed a duffel bag and said he can't live like this. He said he needs space. He said he'll come back when they're a little older and the apartment is quieter. Sarah sank into a chair. Her pregnant belly made moving quickly difficult, and she dropped heavily onto the kitchen stool. Ashley, he couldn't have just done that. He could, and he did. They're 3 days old, Sarah. 3 days, they take turns screaming. I feed them, I change their diapers, I try to rock them, and I am entirely alone. My mom drove down to help, but she's in her late 60s and has a bad back. She can barely stand. And what about Victor? Victor told me I'd figure it out, he said. Women always figure it out. Women always figure it out. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. She knew that exact phrase. Victor had deployed it countless times. When she was bedridden, recovering from an egg retrieval procedure, when she was sobbing on the bathroom floor after a negative pregnancy test, when she physically couldn't pull herself out of bed due to blinding depression and grief. You'll figure it out. You're strong. Which roughly translated to, I do not care that you are suffering. Deal with it yourself, so it doesn't inconvenience me. Ashley, listen to me. Do you have anyone else who can come over? Friends? Relatives? Nobody. I don't have any friends out here. I moved into this brand new subdivision with him, away from my old neighborhood. I'm completely isolated. Sarah fell silent. A thought had just smashed into her brain. It was absurd. It was completely irrational. It defied all human logic, but she voiced it anyway. I can come over tomorrow morning. What? Why? To help. I'm on maternity leave. I'm not due for another 3 months. I can absolutely be useful. I can hold them, rock them, cook a meal, whatever you and your mom need. Ashley was silent for so long that Sarah assumed the call had dropped. Are you serious? Ashley finally asked, her voice cracking. After everything he did to you? After everything I did to you? You didn't do anything to me, Ashley. You just fell in love with the wrong man. That isn't a crime, believe me. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Mark drove Sarah to Ashley's apartment the next morning. He didn't say a word the entire drive until he finally glanced at her from the driver's seat and shook his head in disbelief. You are an incredible human being, Sarah. I'm just a normal person, Mark. I just remember exactly what it feels like to be completely alone while your entire world collapses. Ashley lived in a massive, sprawling new construction complex in the outer suburbs. It was a sterile, 2-bedroom apartment with bare drywall and unfinished renovations. The wallpaper in the hallway stopped halfway up the wall. The master bathroom was missing floor tiles. The kitchen island was a temporary slab of cheap laminate. Victor had clearly promised to finish the remodel and bailed on it. Classic Victor. The door was opened by an older woman with a deeply haggard face, Ashley's mother, Valerie. From down the hall came the thin, piercing, unmistakable shriek of a newborn baby. Sarah instantly recognized the sound from her friends who had children. A newborn's cry is visceral. You can't confuse it with anything else. Are you Sarah? Valerie asked, and her voice was so utterly drained that Sarah wanted to immediately force her into a recliner and wrap a blanket around her. Yes. I'm here to help. Valerie stepped aside, letting her into the apartment. In the older woman's exhausted eyes, there flashed an emotion that wasn't quite gratitude, it was pure astonishment. The ex-wife had shown up to help the new wife with the ex-husband's newborn twins. It was a scenario that broke the brain, but life occasionally orchestrates exactly these kinds of bizarre collisions. Ashley was sitting on a messy, unmade bed in the master bedroom. Her hair was matted into a rat's nest. She had dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes, and her bathrobe was buttoned crookedly. She was awkwardly cradling one infant in her arms, while the second lay in a bassinet, screaming bloody murder. When Sarah walked in, Ashley looked up, and in that one glance lay a horrific cocktail of emotions: paralyzing shame, total despair, massive relief, and fear. "Hey," Sarah said softly. "Just hand me the one that's crying. My hands are free." She leaned over the bassinet and carefully scooped up the baby. A boy, tiny, red, wrinkly, with his eyes squeezed shut and his mouth wide open in a wail. Sarah pulled him tightly against her chest, and suddenly, he went dead silent. He just stopped screaming, buried his tiny nose into her collarbone, and let out a soft snort. Sarah stood there, gently swaying from side to side, feeling the tiny, fragile body breathing against her. Warm, weightless, alive. "He never stops crying," Ashley said, her voice completely wrecked. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I feed him, I change him, I swaddle him, and he just screams." "Sometimes they just want to be held," Sarah said. "It happens. Babies are like sponges. They feel when their mother is having a panic attack, and they panic right back." Ashley stared at her with wide, bloodshot eyes. "How do you know that? You've never even had a—" She cut herself off, realizing what she was saying, and her face burned bright red. "I am so sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Sarah said calmly. "I haven't had children, but I've read every parenting book on the planet. I spent 9 years studying for this test. My theoretical knowledge is flawless. I'm just lacking the practical hours. So, I'm getting some practice in." She offered a warm smile, and miraculously, Ashley smiled back. It was weak, just a slight twitch of the corner of her mouth, but it was a smile. Probably the very first one she'd managed in days. Sarah spent the entire day at Ashley's apartment. She cooked a massive batch of chicken soup, while Valerie rocked the baby girl. She ran 3 loads of laundry, mopped the hardwood floors, and unpacked and organized towering stacks of baby supplies that were still sitting in Amazon delivery boxes in the corner of the living room. Ashley slept. Sarah had essentially forced her to lie down. The young mother passed out the absolute second her head hit the pillow, and she slept like the dead for 4 straight hours, while Sarah and Valerie managed the twins. That evening, when Mark pulled up to the curb to pick Sarah up, Valerie walked her to the front door and suddenly grabbed her by both hands. "Sweetheart," the older woman said, her eyes welling with tears. "I do not know how to thank you. Ashley told me everything. Who you are, what you were to Victor. And you still walked through that door to help us. I have not met many people like you in my life. Please, don't thank me," Sarah said gently. "The babies didn't do anything wrong, and honestly, neither did Ashley." Sarah drove out there 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. She brought groceries, helped bathe the infants, and simply sat on the couch with Ashley when the younger woman desperately needed to vent. Ashley told her all about Victor. How beautifully he had courted her, how he had promised her the world, how he swore that things with her would be magical, totally unlike the misery of his first marriage. Sarah listened and recognized the script word for word. It was the exact same Victor, running the exact same play. He just swapped out the lead actress. The director remained identical. Victor reappeared after 3 weeks. He came back, exactly as he had promised, when things quieted down. He showed up with a pathetic bouquet of flowers, a guilty expression on his face, and a highly rehearsed speech about how he had overreacted, how much he loved her, and how everything was going to be fine now. Ashley stood in the doorway and stared at him. Sarah never found out what happened next, because it was no longer her story. It was Ashley's narrative now, and Ashley had to live through the rest of it herself. In September, Sarah officially went on maternity leave. Her belly was massive, walking had become a chore, and her ankles swelled like water balloons by 4 p.m. Dr. Evans had sternly ordered her to stay off her feet. Mark accepted the foreman position, which meant a solid pay bump, and money was no longer an issue. They weren't wealthy, but they had everything they needed. Martha brought over Tupperware containers of casseroles, jars of homemade jam, and fresh vegetables from her garden. Katie came over every weekend and sat next to Sarah on the couch, reading fantasy novels aloud to Sarah's stomach. She had read an article online claiming that babies in the womb recognize voices, and she was determined that her little brother would recognize hers the second he was born. Sarah went into labor in November, early in the morning, just as the first slushy sleet of the season began to fall in the Midwest. Mark grabbed the hospital bag, which had been packed and waiting by the door for a month, loaded her into his truck, and held her hand the entire terrifying, agonizing drive to the hospital. At the maternity ward triage, the nurses made him wait out in the hallway while they admitted her. He sat on a hard vinyl chair against the wall and waited. He waited for 7 hours. He didn't pace, he didn't leave to get coffee. He didn't complain. The baby boy was born at 3 p.m. 7 pounds, 1 ounce, 20 inches long. He let out a furious, deafening shriek the second he arrived. 10 fingers and 10 toes accounted for. When the nurse laid him on Sarah's bare chest, she looked down into his cloudy, dark eyes and whispered, "Hi, I've been waiting for you. I've been waiting for you for a very long time." The nurses allowed Mark into the delivery room an hour later. He walked in, saw Sarah holding the tightly swaddled infant, and froze in the doorway. He just stood there, staring. Sarah watched his Adam's apple bob violently as he swallowed, entirely unable to suppress the overwhelming wave of emotion rising in his throat. "Come here," she said softly. "Come meet your son." Mark walked over, sat gingerly on the edge of the hospital bed, and tentatively reached out to touch the baby's impossibly tiny hand with his index finger. The infant blindly grasped Mark's thick, calloused finger and squeezed tight. Mark looked up at Sarah, and in his eyes, she saw something she had never once seen in 9 years of marriage to Victor. Absolute, unadulterated happiness. Pure, simple, without any strings attached, without any hidden traps. "What are we naming him?" Mark asked, his voice rough and thick. "Mom wants Michael." "After my dad." "Michael," Mark said, testing the weight of it on his tongue. "Mikey. It's a good name. It's a strong name." Martha rushed into the hospital room that evening. She held her grandson in her arms, crying and laughing at exactly the same time. She kissed the top of his fuzzy head and whispered something to him that Sarah couldn't quite catch, but understood perfectly anyway. 3 generations of women, the grandmother, the mother, and now Sarah. They had carried endurance in their blood, passing it down to one another along with their dark eyes and the stubborn set of their jaws. But today, the endurance had finally paid off. Today, life had not taken something away. It had given something back. Generously, with both hands, without any agonizing caveats. Little Mikey slept soundly in his grandmother's arms. Outside the hospital window, the sleet had turned to thick, heavy snow. Mark stood right beside the bed, resting a heavy, warm hand on Sarah's shoulder. And in that sterile hospital room, smelling of iodine and bleached linens, it was crowded with people, and absolutely overflowing with joy. Sarah closed her eyes and thought, this is it. This was exactly what made all of it worth surviving. The 9 years of agonizing heartbreak, the brutal betrayal, the suffocating loneliness, the empty swing sets at the park, the other women's children, the sobbing on the cold bathroom floor, and the endless, sleepless nights. All of it was merely the long, brutal road that led her right here, to this exact minute. To this tiny human being, clutching his father's finger, who had absolutely no idea just how desperately he had been wished for. She wasn't going to spend another second picking up the shattered pieces of her old, broken happiness. She didn't need to. She had a brand new one, whole, uncracked, and infinitely warm. She pulled it tightly against her chest and vowed she was never going to let it go.